Her husband laughed as he pointed to the seat in coach. His face was full of pride and meanness. He waved her off like she didn't matter, telling her to enjoy the back of the plane. People around them looked over. Some even chuckled. She felt embarrassed, but she didn't say anything. She just smiled, even though it hurt inside. He didn't know what was about to happen. Her name was Rachel. She was 34 and worked hard as a marketing executive. Just last week, she got a big promotion. To celebrate, she planned a nice trip for both of them. It was supposed to be a happy time, but Doug, her husband, had changed a lot. After losing his job, he became bitter and rude. He no longer supported her success. Instead, he tried to bring her down. At the airport, she found out something strange. Doug had booked himself a seat in first class, but for her, he gave her a seat in coach, on purpose. He said it was a mistake, but then made jokes about it in front of strangers. He laughed loudly, showing her economy ticket to others and making her feel like a joke. It was cruel, but she stayed calm. What Doug didn't know was that Rachel had frequent flyer status from all her work trips. Sometimes that meant a surprise upgrade, and today was one of those days. As she stood quietly at the gate, the airline worker smiled and handed her a new ticket. First class, seat 2A. Right next to Doug. Rachel didn't say a word. She waited until almost everyone had boarded. Then, with quiet confidence, she stepped into first class. Doug was already sitting down, looking proud. When he saw her walking toward him, his smile dropped. She sat down beside him without even looking his way. He opened his mouth, like he wanted to say something, but no words came out. She leaned back in the soft seat, accepted a glass of champagne from the flight attendant, and gave a small smile. Doug sat there, stunned and silent. The game had just begun, and this time Rachel was ready to play. She waited until almost everyone else had boarded the plane. Doug was already in his seat up front, looking pleased with himself. He still thought she was sitting back in economy, and that thought made him smug. He probably imagined her crammed between strangers, struggling with no legroom, while he stretched out and ordered wine. But Rachel wasn't in a hurry. She wanted him to enjoy that feeling a little longer. Earlier, as they waited at the gate, Doug had rolled his eyes at her dress. She wore a simple, elegant navy blue dress, one that made her feel confident. He glanced at her and said, "You're really wearing that on a flight?" Like she was trying too hard. She just smiled and said nothing. She had learned not to argue anymore. Doug always found something to criticize. It didn't matter what she wore, said, or did. He found a way to make her feel small. Finally, she boarded. As she stepped into the first-class cabin, Doug looked up. His eyes widened, and his mouth opened like he'd seen a ghost. "What are you doing here?" he asked, voice low but tense. Rachel calmly showed her boarding pass. "Seat 2B, she said with a polite smile. He blinked. "But I thought—" He started, then stopped. She sat down next to him without another word. A moment later, a flight attendant came by with champagne. Rachel took a glass, leaned back, and enjoyed the moment. The man sitting on her other side turned to her and smiled. "That's a great dress," he said warmly. "You look like someone with somewhere important to be." Rachel laughed lightly. "Thank you," she replied. "That's kind of you to say." Doug didn't say a word, but his face tightened. She could feel his eyes on her, full of irritation. He hated not being in control. As the plane took off, memories flashed through Rachel's mind. Birthdays he forgot, the way he called her promotion just lucky, and how he joked with his friends that she probably slept her way to the top. He made her feel like she was never good enough, even when she gave him everything. But now, something felt different. Sitting in that first-class seat, with champagne in hand, and a stranger treating her with respect, she realized how tired she was of making herself small for him. She had earned that seat, just like she had earned her job, her success, and her peace. Doug sat beside her, trying to make passive-aggressive remarks under his breath. She didn't respond. Instead, she smiled out the window, as if he didn't exist. Let him stew. Doug was clearly uncomfortable. He hadn't expected her to be in first class, sitting right next to him like an equal. He shifted in his seat, trying to act cool, but his eyes kept darting toward her. Rachel ignored him and sipped her champagne, relaxed and quiet. When the flight attendant came by to check their names and meal preferences, Doug saw an opportunity. With a forced smile, he said, "She's with me, my assistant." His voice was casual, like it was nothing important. Just a little detail to explain why someone like her was sitting in first class. Rachel didn't even turn her head. She just waited. The flight attendant looked at her tablet, then looked back at Doug. "That's funny," she said with a bright, polite smile. "Her name's listed as the primary passenger for this seat. Looks like she was upgraded before anyone else." Doug's smile froze. He let out a weird little laugh. "Oh, right. Must have been a mix-up." The attendant just nodded and moved on, but the damage was done. A few nearby passengers had overheard. One man across the aisle looked at Rachel, then at Doug with clear judgment on his face. A woman behind them gave Doug a little side-eye before going back to her magazine. Rachel leaned back in her seat and pulled out her phone. She opened a message to her best friend, Jenna, and typed, "This flight just became entertainment." She pressed send and smiled to herself. Doug sat stiffly beside her, clearly rattled. He muttered something about people being too nosy, but Rachel didn't respond. Let him squirm. He had tried to reduce her. Again, just like always. But this time, someone else saw it. This time, the lie didn't work, and it made him look small. Rachel kept her cool. She didn't need to say a word. The truth had spoken for her, and it felt good, better than she expected. The plane continued to taxi toward takeoff, but for Rachel, it already felt like she was rising above it all. When they stepped off the plane, Doug acted like nothing had happened. No mention of the flight, no comment about the seat mix-up, not even a joke. He just walked ahead like he always did, letting Rachel trail behind him. It was hot and sunny, the kind of weather made for relaxing, for celebration. But already, she felt the weight returning to her shoulders. They arrived at the luxury resort she had paid for. Rachel had used her promotion bonus to plan the entire trip, thinking they both needed time away. She booked the Ocean View suite, arranged the airport pickup, and even upgraded their spa access. Doug hadn't lifted a finger. Yet, as soon as they arrived, he tossed his bag toward her and said, "Can you handle check-in? I'm going to grab a drink." Then he wandered off, without waiting for an answer. She stood there in the lobby, juggling both suitcases while trying to talk to the front desk staff. Doug returned a few minutes later with a cold drink in one hand and a smirk on his face. He made flirty small talk with the young woman working at the check-in desk. "It's not easy keeping up with her," he said, nodding toward Rachel. "But I take good care of my woman." Rachel didn't say anything. She just gave a polite smile and took the room key. Later that afternoon, they were sitting by the pool when another couple struck up a conversation with them. The man asked Rachel what she did for work. Before she could answer, Doug jumped in. "She's in marketing. Just got lucky with a promotion. I told her it was probably because they needed more women at the top." Rachel felt her stomach drop. He laughed like it was a joke, but the couple's smiles faded. The woman gave Rachel a sympathetic glance. Rachel stayed quiet, sipping her drink, pretending it didn't bother her, but it did. A lot. Doug had always done this. Made her success sound like an accident, something she didn't earn. He couldn't stand the fact that she had become the breadwinner, that she was the one providing the lifestyle they were enjoying. She looked around the resort, at the beauty of the place, and felt a strange disconnect. She had brought them here. She had made all of this happen, and yet he was still trying to make her feel small. Dinner that night was at a fancy oceanfront restaurant. Doug had met a couple by the pool earlier. Loud, flashy types who bragged about business deals and private jets. He was eager to impress them. Rachel didn't care much for them, but she went along to keep the peace. When the check came, Doug reached for her credit card. "Babe, I've got this," he said, grabbing her wallet without asking. "It's good networking." She opened her mouth to protest but stopped. She'd seen this before. Doug acting generous with other people using her money. He gave a proud little speech about taking care of the bill, handed the card to the waiter, and raised his glass like a hero. On the way back to the room, he laughed and said, "Don't worry, I'll pay you back. This is an investment in my future." Rachel smiled faintly, but her mind was already somewhere else. Later that night, while Doug snored beside her, Rachel quietly logged into her banking app. She stared at the screen for a moment, then tapped the button. Freeze card. It felt like hitting pause on years of letting him take whatever he wanted. The next day, they sat by the pool again. Doug went to the bar to grab drinks for both of them. A few minutes later, he came back empty-handed. "They said the card got declined," he muttered, clearly annoyed. "Must be a glitch." Rachel raised her sunglasses and looked at him calmly. "That's strange," she said, not offering any help. Doug pulled out his own card and stomped back to the bar, but the mood had shifted. He looked smaller somehow, not in control, like he always tried to be. Rachel leaned back in her chair, feeling the sun on her face. She thought about all the times she'd let things slide, all the times he'd taken from her without even saying thank you. This time, she had drawn a line, quietly, without a fight or a scene, and that made it even better. The next morning, Rachel woke up early and watched the sunrise from the balcony. The ocean was calm, the breeze soft. For the first time in days, she felt peaceful. Doug was still asleep, snoring loudly and taking up most of the bed. She quietly slipped out, put on a sundress, and headed downstairs. Instead of joining the tour they had planned together, a day-long group trip to nearby waterfalls and ruins, Rachel walked straight to the resort spa. She booked a full treatment package: massage, facial, even a private lunch by the pool. For once, she was doing something just for herself. No checking in, no explaining, no asking. Doug found her later that morning just as she was walking out of the spa with a fresh glow and a glass of cucumber water in hand. "Where were you?" he asked, clearly irritated. "The tour left without you. I waited." "I know," Rachel said calmly. "We were supposed to do that together," he snapped. "We came here to bond, remember?" Rachel looked at him and didn't blink. "You made this trip about yourself the second you booked yourself in first class and mocked me in front of strangers." Doug rolled his eyes. "You're still upset about that?" "I'm not upset," she said. "I'm just done pretending it didn't matter." Doug stood there, speechless for a moment, like he didn't recognize her. Then he shook his head and walked off toward the parking area, muttering something about how she was being dramatic. She didn't follow. Instead, she walked back to the spa's relaxation area and let herself unwind. Later, she ordered a solo lunch at the resort's rooftop cafe: shrimp salad, a crisp white wine, and a view that reminded her what peace actually felt like. A few friendly tourists waved at her, and she joined them for light conversation and laughs. Meanwhile, Doug spent the day on a crowded bus with strangers, none of whom cared about his stories or half-finished business ideas. He sent her a few texts: "You'd love this view, wish you were here." But she didn't answer right away. She didn't feel guilty. This was her time, her trip, her money, her peace, and slowly she was taking it all back. The resort's formal dinner was starting in less than an hour. Rachel was already dressed, wearing a sleek black dress with a simple necklace and heels. Her look was effortless and polished. She stood in front of the mirror, adjusting one earring when Doug walked out of the bathroom, towel around his waist and panic in his voice. "Where's my white dress shirt?" he asked, flipping through the closet. "Did you pack it?" Rachel stayed focused on her reflection, smoothing down the fabric of her dress. "No," she said calmly. Doug turned toward her, frowning. "Seriously? I thought you would have. You always pack that kind of stuff." She looked at him through the mirror and answered with a straight face. "Oh, right. I'm just the assistant, remember?" His hands stopped moving. The silence that followed said everything. Doug blinked, trying to brush it off with a weak laugh. "You're not still upset about that, are you?" Rachel finally turned to face him. "You said it. To a flight attendant, in front of a full cabin. You made me feel small again." "It was a joke," he mumbled, digging deeper into his suitcase. "Can't you let stuff go?" She picked up her clutch and headed for the door. "Dinner starts in 10 minutes. I'm not missing it." Doug looked up from his suitcase, now clearly frustrated. "What am I supposed to wear?" Rachel didn't slow down. "You'll figure it out. You always do, especially when it's for your own image." She left him standing in the room, surrounded by wrinkled shirts and excuses. At the restaurant, she was seated quickly, greeted by name. A few guests nearby gave her admiring glances as she sat alone with a quiet grace. She ordered a glass of wine and enjoyed a plate of grilled fish, not caring who noticed that she came alone. Doug showed up almost 20 minutes later in a short-sleeved shirt that didn't meet the dress code. The hostess gave him a look, but let it slide. He sat down, visibly uncomfortable, and didn't speak for a while. Rachel didn't rush to fill the silence. She didn't offer sympathy or ask why he was late. She simply continued with her dinner. And in that silence, Doug finally seemed to understand. She wasn't playing the same role anymore. Doug was sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through his phone, acting like everything was fine. Rachel stood by the small table near the window, watching him, her heart strangely steady. The air between them felt thick, like something important was finally about to break. "You've been cold all day," Doug said, not looking up. "Are you really still mad over a few little things? You're overreacting." Rachel took a deep breath, then quietly reached into her purse. She pulled out a thin, manila folder and placed it on the table between them. "What's that?" Doug asked, confused. She met his eyes and said, "Divorce papers. I drafted them before we came here." Doug blinked hard, like he didn't understand what she'd just said. Then he laughed nervously. "You're kidding, right?" "I'm not," Rachel said calmly. "I was already thinking about it. This trip was the last chance. I wanted to see if there was anything left to fight for." Doug stood up, the phone dropping onto the bed. "Wait. No. Come on, Rachel. We've had a rough patch, sure. But this, you're not being fair." She folded her arms. "Fair? You humiliated me in public. You made me feel like less than a person. You spent my money, dismissed my career, and treated me like an assistant instead of a partner. And you think I'm being unfair?" His voice cracked. Okay. I've messed up. But people make mistakes, right? Can't we talk about it? Work on it?" Rachel shook her head slowly. "That's the problem. We've already talked. And I've already worked. I've given you second chances. More than I can count. You always promised to change. And I always believed you. But nothing ever really did." Doug started pacing, hands on his head. "You're serious about this? You really want to throw away everything we built?" "What did we build, Doug?" she asked softly. "Because from where I'm standing, I built a life, and you just lived in it." His face fell. For the first time, he looked small, unsure of himself. Rachel picked up the folder and placed it back in her bag. "I haven't filed them yet, but I will, when we get back." Doug didn't argue. He just sat down slowly, as if he didn't know what else to say. Rachel turned toward the door, calm and clear. This trip was never about saving us. It was about seeing if there was still a we to save. And now I know. Doug didn't say much the next morning. After the argument and the divorce papers, he just paced the room in silence, tossing his clothes into a suitcase with quick, jerky movements. Rachel sat on the balcony with a coffee, not rushing to stop him, not trying to talk him down. She had nothing left to explain. "I changed my flight," he finally said. "I'm leaving this afternoon." Rachel only nodded. "Okay." That one word said everything. Doug waited a beat, maybe expecting her to beg him to stay, but she didn't. He left without a hug, without a backward glance. The door shut quietly behind him, and just like that, she was alone. But it didn't feel lonely. Rachel walked to the front desk and extended her stay by 2 nights. She booked a nature hike for the next morning, a spa lunch for the afternoon. That night she joined a few solo travelers at the beach bar. They laughed over cocktails, swapped stories about life and work. For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt like herself, not someone's assistant, not someone being tolerated, just Rachel. She went hiking the next day with a small tour group led by a local guide named Luis. He was cheerful and full of energy, pointing out wild plants and hidden paths. At one point, as the group rested at a lookout spot, Luis sat beside her. "You're traveling alone now?" he asked kindly. She smiled. Not how the trip started, but yes. He looked at her for a moment, then said, "You don't look like someone lost. You look like someone who just realized she's free." Rachel didn't reply right away, but her smile widened. The wind moved through the trees. Later she journaled for the first time in years. She wrote about how small she had let herself become, how much she had ignored to keep the peace, and how she wasn't going to do that anymore. Doug was gone, but in his absence, something stronger had filled the space. Peace, clarity, and the beginning of something new. Rachel stepped off the plane feeling lighter than she had in years. The trip hadn't gone the way she expected, but in the end, it gave her something even more valuable than a vacation: clarity. She walked through the airport, wheeling her own suitcase with quiet pride. There was no one waiting to greet her, and for once, she was glad. At home, she unpacked slowly, carefully folding each piece of clothing. She didn't cry. She didn't second-guess anything. The manila folder with the divorce papers sat neatly on the kitchen counter. That same afternoon, she signed them and called her lawyer. The days that followed felt like waking up from a long, dull dream. Her apartment seemed brighter. Her morning coffee tasted richer. Her playlist felt like hers again. She met with her friends, and when she told them the full story, they didn't say, "We told you so." They said, "We're proud of you." At work, people noticed something had shifted. Rachel spoke up more. She led meetings with calm confidence. Her boss pulled her aside after one presentation and said, "Whatever happened on that trip, keep it. You've never been sharper." The messages from Doug started coming in less than a week after he left the resort. First, a short text. "Can we talk?" Then a longer email. Then a flower delivery with a note that said, "I messed up. Please don't give up on us." She didn't respond to any of it. There was no anger in her silence, just peace. She didn't need to explain anything anymore. Doug had already heard her speak. He just hadn't listened. Rachel wasn't broken. She was rebuilding. She started running again in the mornings, something she'd stopped doing years ago because Doug said it was a waste of time. She reconnected with her college friend from Boston and even signed up for a photography class on weekends. One evening, as she poured herself a glass of wine and looked out her window, she thought about the moment at the airport when Doug had laughed at her coach ticket, not knowing she'd been upgraded to first class. That moment had felt awful, but now it felt like the start of something. He tried to shrink her to make himself feel taller. Now he had to watch her rise without him, from coach to first class, and everything beyond. Do you think Rachel did the right thing by walking away from Doug and choosing herself? Or should she have given him one more chance to change? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious to hear what you think. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new one.